Imagine for a moment that you're a child in Armenia or Azerbaijan, some decades far removed from the conflict which broke out in 2020, in the midst of an already trying year. As you play with your friends in a field, you notice something that looks interesting. It's probably the same size, shape, and color as this soda can I have right here. Being the young and curious child that you are, you decide to pick it up. Little did you know, what you just picked up was an unexploded cluster bomb that was used during the war. And if by some chance it detonated, well, you've either been seriously injured, possibly even killed. You're a casualty of a war which ostensibly already ended. And this war which already ended is where our story begins. The recent Nagorno-Karabakh conflict serves as just one more example of how unexploded munitions continue to pose a threat in the present. Beyond the obvious threat to safety, these explosives also hamper human development by denying access to productive resources like farmland or sources of water. They also limit people's access to trails and roadways, and they incur direct cost on society through the sacrifices that people must make in order to either eliminate the problem or adapt to living with it. Such sacrifices can include the cost of removing the explosives, medical costs from treating casualties of incidents, and costs associated with education and awareness campaigns. At present, the Global Explosive Remnants of War, or ERW problem, faces several challenges related to its resolution. Firstly, a high degree of variability is noted with the types of ERW in different countries. Some deal mainly with cluster bombs, while others suffer from high concentrations of landmines instead. Given that active conflicts continue the proliferation, however, of ERW, there's a decent amount of overlap for the two types. The second challenge faced by the international community relates to international agreements, such as the 1997 Ottawa Treaty or the 2008 Convention on Cluster Munitions. These agreements to limit weapon use only go so far when some of the key global players like the US, China, and Russia refuse to sign them, usually due to internal defense interests which they try and argue for the necessity of these weapons. So what's my contribution to the issue at hand? Given that currently, many of the foremost world powers are not signatories to these agreements, I think a logical option for cultivating de facto compliance would be to push for alternative weapons which don't create the risk of creating long-lasting hazards. Let's use the US as an example, given that it hasn't signed either treaty and its record of committing to elimination of these weapons is spotty. Currently, US military doctrine for cluster bombs states that these weapons are tactically necessary and viable in certain situations, yet no branch of the armed forces has used such weapons since 2009, over a decade ago. Despite controversial moves such as the Trump administration's rollback of a Bush-era DoD policy aimed at reducing U.S. cluster bomb stockpiles, development of non-explosive alternatives to cluster bombs continues. One promising example is the AGM-R9X, a modified Hellfire missile which utilizes the kinetic energy of being dropped from high altitudes rather than an explosive payload to kill its target. The missile has already seen use by the U.S. military in several notable drone strikes on Al-Qaeda members, and is promising thanks to its lack of potential for collateral damage, as seen in the photos. Other than the hole in the roof of the car, the rest of the chassis remains practically unscathed given the circumstances, and this lack of possible unexploded ordnance is exactly what anti-cluster munitions advocates would be in favor of. Another change which can be made by the international community to stifle the production of these weapons in the short term is to pursue an aggressive financial divestment campaign. Whereas intergovernmental agreements like the Ottawa Treaty have been shown to reduce the prevalence of ERW in countries which agree to them, these agreements are ultimately only a temporary remedy if they don't address the production by the private sector. As such, a quick and decisive multinational push to sever ties with financial institutions which fund this production could theoretically exert enough pressure to course correct, but this maneuver requires a full commitment on the part of all involved. While not panaceas to the global ERW problem as a whole, based on the reading I did, these two suggestions seem like feasible short-term solutions with implementation processes which are relatively straightforward if committed to fully and early enough. Hopefully by now I've given a comprehensive enough overview of explosive remnants of war as a global issue, as well as some of the ways that we can think about contributing to its resolution. I'd like to thank you all for your time. This is Tyler, signing off.